Night clung to the mountains above Salerno like damp cloth. The sea below still burned in places, fuel fires trembling on dark water where landing craft had been left to rot under German shell fire. Far inland, artillery sounded like a distant storm that would not pass. Somewhere above the beachhead, a narrow mountain track cut through olive trees and broken stone, used for centuries by farmers and smugglers, now turned into a firing corridor pointed straight at the Allied invasion force. And on that path, moving uphill through dust and moon shadow, was a British officer whose silhouette did not belong to this war. Lieutenant Colonel John Churchill did not carry himself like a man from 1943. A medieval broadsword hung openly at his side. A longbow rode his shoulder. A submachine gun would have made sense. A rifle would have been comforting. But Churchill carried a weapon that had not tasted battle in centuries. Around him, hand-picked commandos climbed in silence, boots slipping on loose stone, every sense alive to the possibility of sudden death. Above them, German mortars waited with loaded mouths, aimed not at soldiers, but at the lifeline of the invasion itself. Night after night, men died on that mountain. But this night would end with 42 Germans walking downhill unarmed, prisoners, behind a man who had been laughed at for bringing a sword to a gunfight. And nothing about that night would ever again seem ridiculous. By September 1943, the Second World War had already devoured 4 years of human history. Cities were rubble, empires were cracking, entire nations had been reduced to factories of smoke, bone, and metal. The war had moved like fire across Europe, and now it was reaching south, into the mountains, valleys, and ancient roads of Italy. What had once been Roman provinces and Renaissance cities were becoming modern killing fields, not for glory, not for ceremony, but for logistics and survival. 8 weeks before the Allied landings at Salerno, another invasion had reshaped the map. In July 1943, British and American forces came ashore in Sicily. It was not a clean victory. It was hot, confused, and costly. But it worked. Axis resistance collapsed from the coast inward, and by August, the largest island in the Mediterranean had fallen into Allied hands. For the first time since the war began, German forces had been pushed off occupied European territory on a massive scale. The illusion of Axis invincibility cracked. The political shockwave from Sicily did not stop at the shoreline. In Rome, Benito Mussolini was dismissed and arrested by his own king. Italy, the proud partner of Germany, buckled under the weight of defeat. On September 8, 1943, the Italian government announced an armistice with the Allies. To civilians, this sounded like the war was over. To German commanders, it sounded like betrayal. Within hours, German forces poured into Italy. Entire Italian divisions were disarmed at gunpoint. Ports, roads, and railways were seized. Former allies became occupiers overnight. German troops moved with speed that betrayed planning. Hitler had long expected Italy to crack. Operation Oxa began. Germany absorbed the Italian war machine and took control of the country's defenses. South of Rome, new battle lines were being carved into valleys and villages that had never known industrial war. For the Allies, Italy now represented more than a symbolic victory. It was a strategic opening. If they could seize southern ports, they could push northward, threatening Germany's underbelly, forcing the Reich to divert troops from the Eastern Front and from France, where another invasion was already being planned. Italy was not the main battlefield, but it could bleed the enemy. The chosen point was Salerno. The Bay of Salerno curved inward like a shield, offering deep water for ships and flat terrain for establishing airstrips. Beyond the beaches rose a spine of steep hills and narrow passes, the kind that had shaped wars since antiquity. Whoever held those heights controlled the coastline below. Whoever lost them bled. On September 9th, 1943, the U.S. Fifth Army under General Mark Clark came ashore. To the north, British X-Corps landed near Salerno itself. To the south, American Sixth Corps pushed inland. Between them lay rivers, broken bridges, and mountain towns that would soon become names etched into casualty rolls. Off the coast stood Allied warships, their guns trained inland, providing the only reliable fire support during the fragile first hours of occupation. But the Germans were waiting. The 16th Panzer Division did not break. It recoiled, and then it surged forward again. German artillery rolled into the hills. Self-propelled guns took positions above the beaches. Mortar teams dug in where olive groves gave way to stone terraces. Orders were simple: contain the beachhead. If possible, destroy it. And for the first days, they nearly succeeded. German counterattacks slammed into the Allied lines in waves. Tanks pushed within shelling distance of command posts. Infantry fought in vineyards and along roads that had never heard a gunshot before. Casualties mounted by the hour. Medical stations overflowed. The sea behind the landings became a graveyard of amphibious wreckage. Salerno did not fall easily into Allied hands. It resisted. It bled. And above it, in the hills, German observation posts watched every movement below. If the German gunners could see you, they could kill you. Mortar fire from elevated positions rained down with merciless precision. One well-positioned observer could direct shelling that turned assembly areas into slaughter fields. One machine gun nest could freeze entire advances. The heights above Salerno were not terrain, they were weapons. So, the Allies did what they had done all across occupied Europe. They sent the commandos, hand-selected, cross-trained, lightly equipped, armed for climbing as much as killing. Their job was not to hold ground, but to cut it out from underneath the enemy. Remove antennas, silence battery crews, collapse observation posts into darkness. This was never glamorous work. It did not end in parades. Most commando operations were never photographed. Many were never spoken of again. And into this landscape of smoke, ash, rifles, and observation binoculars walked a man who still wore steel at his side, John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. To his superiors, he was brilliant and uncontrollable. To his men, fearless to the point of improbability. To history, unforgettable. In the modern army, his sword made him look absurd. On the mountain above Salerno, it would make him dangerous. And when the call came down that a German observation post above the village of Molina had to be eliminated, quietly, quickly, and without alerting the batteries beyond it, there was no doubt who would climb first. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill did not grow out of the earth like a soldier. He was not shaped by trenches or trained for mechanized war. He came instead from an older world, one that still believed in personal courage and in the weight of steel held in a single hand. He was born in 1906 into the lingering breath of the Victorian Empire, a Britain that still whispered about cavalry charges and imperial banners. His father was a colonial civil servant, which meant Jack's childhood unfolded far from English fields. He grew up partially in Hong Kong, then in Ceylon, among languages and heat, and the quiet authority of British uniforms worn overseas. For him, the army would never be an abstraction. It was part of the architecture of life. When he joined the British Army in the 1920s, his first posting was Burma, a borderland of jungle and humidity, where an enemy did not always wear uniform. There, he learned patience, survival, movement in unfamiliar terrain. He also learned that discipline could be comfortable and boredom could be lethal. He left the army in the early 1930s not from disillusionment, but from restlessness. He was not the kind of man designed for peacetime. Civil life never held him. In Nairobi, he worked as a newspaper editor, but writing did not cage him any more than barracks did. He boxed, he modeled, he acted. He represented Britain in international archery competitions. In 1939, just months before Europe ignited, he shot for Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo. These things did not make sense to the kind of men who wore stars on their collars, but sense was never what Jack Churchill was after. He was shaped by capability, not conformity. He also began to acquire a reputation. He carried a longbow because he was good with it, not decent, not talented, lethal. To this he added the Scottish broadsword, not for show, but as equipment. He learned to maintain it like a surgeon maintains a scalpel. He practiced with it the way another man practiced with a revolver. When war finally came, he returned to uniform as if he had simply stepped out for a cigarette and come back when the guns started firing. France, 1940. It was there, amid the disintegration of Allied lines, that Churchill loosed an arrow into a German patrol and killed a man with a weapon last seen in medieval battlefields. There are no embellishments in that moment. It is one of the last recorded battlefield kills made by longbow in history. It was not a trick. It was not for attention. It was because he knew how. From then on, whatever could be said of him, it could never be said he did not belong. As Britain rebuilt its broken army, it also reinvented it. Out of defeat came innovation. The commandos were born in embarrassment and pressure, meant to strike coastlines, sabotage infrastructure, terrify the enemy by appearing where no enemy should exist. Churchill found them the way a blade finds its sheath. He joined the commandos and never looked back. He led from the front, not out of ego, but out of belief. An officer, he said, belonged where bullets were flying. Anything else was theater. He carried bagpipes into battle not because they were symbolic, because they were psychological. When the pipes sounded, men followed. When German troops heard music where no music belonged, uncertainty spread. In a war built on control, he introduced chaos. In Norway, in raids along the European coastline, men watched in disbelief as he moved through machine gun fire, with a medieval sword at his side and a pipe tune on his lips. Bullets were modern. Churchill was not. That made people afraid, both sides. By 1943, he had become officer commanding No. 2 Commando. He did not command by shouting. He did not lead from tents. He led by walking into killing zones first. To some, he was a lunatic. To his men, he was an anchor. They saw what courage looked like when it did not flinch, when it did not calculate, when it did not crouch. And in return, they followed him where maps ended and cliffs began. By the time he arrived in Italy, he was no longer a man. He was a legend wearing boots. And now the war had given him mountains. Sicily had hardened him again. He watched cities burn from afar and men disappear into terrain like smoke. Italy was not Normandy. It was steep, it was fractured, and it was perfect for war, conducted in shadows. When Operation Avalanche began and No. 2 Commando waded ashore at Velletri sul Mare, Churchill walked onto Italian soil, armed not just with weapons, but with a philosophy that had followed him since Burma. Violence, he believed, worked best when it arrived unexpectedly. Above Salerno, the enemy had followed tradition. Guns on high ground, observers in towers, mortars pointed toward beaches like accusing fingers. What they had not planned for was history itself walking uphill toward them in the dark. And when orders were cut for a small unit to eliminate the German observation post above Molina, not with artillery, not with air power, but with fists and boots and knives, there was no debate about who would lead. Churchill did not volunteer. He was simply already moving. The men who followed John Churchill up the slopes above Salerno did not see a hero climbing ahead of them. They saw a certainty. Someone whose confidence was so complete, it silenced doubt by proximity alone. To be near him was to feel the war sharpen. He did not promise survival. He promised purpose. His sword was not a novelty to them. It was a signal. A quiet announcement that if this man was willing to charge machine gun positions armed like a Highland officer from a forgotten century, then hesitation no longer had a place. Churchill did not wear courage like a banner. He moved with it as if it were a muscle. When he chose men, he did not look for bravado. He looked for balance. The commando teams he commanded were lean, not in number, but in intention. Every man could climb. Every man was trained to fight at arm's length. Every man knew how to survive alone. When Churchill moved, he moved with soldiers who understood that silence was a weapon and darkness was armor. The raid at Molina was not planned for spectacle. It was calculated. The German observation post on the hill was not an outpost of a dozen tired men. It was an eye, a nerve. It fed into mortar teams and artillery batteries that were crushing Allied advance routes. Remove the eye, and the beast would flinch. The terrain itself was an ally, and a threat. Vines gave way to stone, stone gave way to trees, and above that, narrow paths twisted like veins through the mountainside. These were not roads. They were scars cut into rock by centuries of foot traffic, mule trails built not for armies, but for desperation. Churchill knew that if German soldiers used them, then so would he. There was no artillery prep, no barrage, no air cover, just boots, just breathing. Just the knowledge that if a sentry raised his voice, the mountain would come alive with fire. And on the other side of that mountain waited men who had been promised victory. The German defenders on the hill were professionals. They were not panicked conscripts. They were trained soldiers positioned with purpose. They believed they held the advantage, which, on paper, they did. Their mortars could reach the beaches. Their eyesight could direct every shell. They knew commandos existed. They did not expect one to arrive carrying a sword. They expected bombardment. They expected probes. They expected aircraft. They did not expect silence. When the first Germans were taken, it happened not in chaos, but in quiet. No wild gunfire, no screaming. A blade is faster than a shout. A shadow can outrun an alarm. In minutes, what had felt permanent to the men on that hill began to feel temporary. Some surrendered without resistance. Others stared before obeying, not because they were cowards, but because fear changes shape when it looks ridiculous at first and then reveals teeth. Churchill did not storm like a madman. He advanced like a professional. The sword was not for swinging wildly. It was for space, for dominance at arm's reach, for ending resistance before it could multiply. And the Germans did what soldiers always do when surprise breaks structure. They obeyed the man with the clearest command voice. It happened again and again. Small clusters of men, disarmed by proximity and authority. The British did not arrive in numbers. They arrived in certainty. By the time the last observation team was neutralized, the hill had gone quiet. Not the quiet of safety, the quiet of submission. Behind Churchill now stood prisoners, and not 10, not 20, dozens. But there were still angles left to this story. Because what happened that night was not only about courage, it was about psychology, technology, and the strange morality of leading others into darkness. The history books list numbers, units, casualties, calibers. But war is not remembered in numbers. It is remembered in impressions, in moments that bend expectations and imprint themselves into memory. John Churchill, carrying a broadsword into modern war, did not win battles by cutting steel. He won them by breaking assumptions. Psychology is not a soft science in combat. It is a weapon. German sentries stationed above Salerno were conditioned to listen for engines, boots, or the cough of artillery. Their enemies arrived on ships. Their threat came from the horizon. Surprise, when expected, loses its edge. But war has no defense against the absurd, suddenly becoming lethal. No German manual prepared soldiers for a man with a sword leading silent soldiers through mountain darkness. No doctrine accounted for intimidation born not of numbers, but of certainty. The human brain relies on pattern. Churchill shattered pattern, and in its place he planted doubt. When a sentry sees 10 men, he calculates weapons. When he sees 2 men, he calculates risk. But when he sees a man who should not exist, carrying a relic while commanding obedience, calculation fails. Fear does not erupt in panic. It settles as paralysis. Men surrender not just when outnumbered. They surrender when they no longer understand the rules of their own survival. Technology, too, was part of this story, in ways that surprised both sides. The Germans possessed superior elevation, better artillery coordination, mortars that could vaporize flesh within seconds. They had radio lines, range charts. Churchill had none of that. He had silence. He had terrain. He had the human nervous system. A longbow does not need a firing pin. A sword does not jam. And in tight spaces where a rifle barrel becomes a liability, steel becomes certainty. He did not fight technology with nostalgia. He bypassed it. The raid was not a romantic act. It was surgical. Destroy communications. Silence fire support. Remove the eyes from the battlefield. This is modern warfare at its most primal, disabling the enemy's perception before dismantling their force. And then there was leadership, the kind that does not appear in diagrams. Officers command. Churchill embodied. He made himself visible when visibility meant death. He carried symbols not because he believed in theater, but because symbols build momentum. A sword makes a man taller. Pipes make soldiers remember why they followed. He did not send his men to die. He walked first. There is no doctrine written for that. Only judgment. The ethics of such leadership remain debated. Some would say it was reckless, that his death would have cost more lives than his culture of daring saved. And yet, Douglas MacArthur once wrote that, "In war, men follow personalities. Not strategy books, not speeches, personal gravity." And Churchill was heavy with it. His men trusted not his equipment. They trusted his calm. In warfare, morality is not about ideals. It is about proximity. Men accept suffering when they do not feel abandoned. Churchill did not abandon. He absorbed. When his men moved, it was not to prove his bravery. It was because his bravery had already issued itself as command, and when the German prisoners eventually formed behind him in line, humiliated not by violence, but by inevitability, the victory became larger than tactical. It became psychological occupation, not of land, of belief. This was how mountain strongholds fall, not always by fire, but by fracture. And in that fracture, the beachhead breathed again, because now guns on the hill no longer saw the sea. And when the sea is unseen, men live. But the moment that changed the battle at Salerno did not end on the hilltop. It took shape afterward, downward, along a road once carved by farmers, now claimed by prisoners. The night of September 13th, 1943, did not feel like a turning point at Salerno. It felt like another exhaustion layered on top of 10,000 others. Below the hills, Allied soldiers were collapsing into foxholes gouged from rock. Above them, German guns continued to speak through darkness. Each explosion echoed longer in the mountains, as if the terrain itself was tired of holding sound. On the beachhead, wounded men waited in lines that did not move. Water ran low in some sectors. Ammunition arrived in bursts when ships survived the approach. Officers spoke in clipped sentences, stripping emotion from language to preserve authority. The invasion still belonged to chance, and chance was cruel. In that uncertainty, orders filtered quietly into the hills. There was a German observation position overlooking the pass near Molina. It had to vanish, not tomorrow, not by weight of fire, tonight. Churchill did not conduct a briefing the way other officers did. He did not unroll maps. He walked the ground with his men, touched stone with bare knuckles, stopped where wind changed temperature. He listened, then he pointed. The climb began without ceremony. A handful of commandos moved like silhouettes sewn into the terrain. They did not speak. They did not gesture more than necessary. The world shrank to breath, gravel, and the pressure of heartbeat in the ears. Above them, occasionally, a flare would open the sky like a tearing wound, bathing rock and leaf in cold white light, then die. Each flare could end the mission. Each could crack the illusion of invisibility. They climbed anyway. Churchill took point, not from arrogance, but instinct. He walked not as if careless, but as if attentive to everything. There is a difference. Carelessness is blind. Churchill was always watching. A small German patrol passed to their right, less than 30 meters away. No one moved, not even to shift weight. They could smell oil and tobacco. Then the footsteps passed, and the world exhaled. Minutes later came the real danger, the mortar position. The sound came before the sight. Dull metal against stone, whispered commands, radio static dying into silence. Two Germans stood with their backs turned. Churchill raised one finger. The world contracted. No signal, no countdown, just movement, like an animal uncoiling. The first man fell without a sound. The second turned, too slowly, and found steel where a rifle should have been. No alarm, no rope of tracer from the ridgeline. The hill remained asleep. They moved from pit to pit, not rushing, but not waiting. When voices rose, the sword ended sentences. When resistance formed, it dissolved before it thickened. It was not a battle. It was a disassembly. Churchill did not bark orders. He commanded in presence. Men came forward stunned, helmets off, hands up, confused not by power, but by momentum they could not interrupt. They were captured not by threat, but by absence of options. More Germans appeared, then more, not charging, opening doors, approaching with raised arms. Some did not even seem frightened. They seemed embarrassed. They had prepared for war. What they received instead was revelation. By the time the observation post itself was breached, the night had lost control of the outcome. It did not belong to the Germans anymore. Inside the post, radios were smashed, maps seized, binoculars claimed. A hand count had not yet been done, but Churchill knew this was larger than expected. Behind him now stood not a skirmish, but a procession. And the hill, which had once issued death downward, was now issuing men. The descent would be worse, because now they were no longer invisible. Now they were responsible. And somewhere below, German artillery crews were waiting for dawn to speak again. If this raid failed halfway down, there would be no medals, only bodies. When Churchill turned the German prisoners toward the descent path, reality finally settled into the moment. It was not a raid anymore. It was a transfer of power. 42 men stood quietly in a line that had not existed an hour earlier. Some were too young, others too tired. A few showed the blank stare of those who had not yet processed surrender. Their radios had been smashed, their weapons stacked. Their hill no longer belonged to them. And now they were expected to walk into darkness behind an enemy who carried a sword. There was no shouting, no humiliation, only order. Churchill placed wounded Germans into wooden carts once used by village farmers. The carts had wide wheels built for stone paths and vineyards. 2 by 2, the prisoners pushed their own wounded comrades downward. The image was absurd and unforgettable. Britain's medieval ghost leading Germany's modern army down an Italian mountainside in 1943. The column moved slowly. Each step downward felt more dangerous than the climb that came before it. The terrain could not be rushed. The prisoners could not be trusted blindly. Churchill walked not behind them, but among them, sword visible, calm, unshaken. From above, they looked like a shadow that did not belong to the hillside. From below, they were invisible. Every bend in the path risked collision with a patrol. Every sound could summon gunfire. A column of prisoners in the dark is not camouflage. It is confession. At one turn, they frozen. German voices, too close for fire, too close to run. Churchill held the group in silence with a raised hand, as if fear listened to him. The voices passed, and the procession breathed again. Downward, stone under boots, flesh under moonlight. Time stretched and snapped like brittle wire, and then, through trees and silence and exhaustion, the Allied lines materialized. Wooden crates, sandbags, a British voice, a challenge in the dark, and then disbelief. The guards did not see commandos returning from patrol. They saw an army. Churchill stepped forward first, sword still at his side, helmet dusted with mountain. Behind him, German prisoners filed into lamplight, 42 men, disarmed, silent, alive. The men on the perimeter stared as if watching something impossible attempt to pass as history. Someone whispered a curse under breath. Someone laughed, sharp, hysterical relief. Someone saluted. Churchill reported without ceremony. Observation post destroyed. Mortar positions taken. German personnel captured. Then he stepped aside, and the prisoners were ushered into holding areas where they sank to the ground, as if gravity had finally remembered them. And something else happened that night. Quiet. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of relief. The guns above the beachhead went blind. Mortars fell silent. The German gunners could no longer see the sea, and the Allied perimeter, cracked, bloodied, shaking, held. Not because of a sword, not because of a legend, but because one night, in one place, momentum changed direction, and the cost of that change was not paid in explosives, but in nerve. For the men who had marched behind Churchill that night, there was no ceremony, no banner, no parade, just the knowledge that sometimes history bends itself around those willing to walk naked into its teeth. And while commanders would later argue about maps and movements, the beach would remember this silence. Because silence is what keeps men alive, but wars do not end in quiet. They echo forward. Morning at Salerno did not bring peace. It brought reckoning. The sky rose pale and washed out above the sea, revealing what night had hidden. Wrecked landing craft, overturned trucks, shell holes punched into ancient farmland. Smoke clung to the hills like a second skin. Somewhere inland, artillery still spoke, but the sound had changed. It was no longer methodical. It was searching. Along the Allied perimeter, officers noticed something that did not appear on any operations map: a silence. The German fire coming from the heights above Molina had weakened. Mortars that had once landed with steady cruelty now arrived late, then not at all. Entire sectors along the pass reported a sudden absence of observation-directed shelling. The pressure on infantry units along the road into Salerno eased by degrees so small that only exhausted men understood how significant it was. Not because it felt like victory, because it felt like breathing. That absence mattered. In an amphibious invasion, observation posts are the nervous system. Without them, fire is blind. Without eyes, even the strongest gunners guess instead of kill. By dawn, commanders knew something had changed, but they did not yet know what. Then word spread. A British commando unit had come down from the hills carrying German prisoners. Not 2, not 10, 42, without tanks, without air support, without artillery, just boots and nerve. Within command posts, this became more than rumor. Reports were taken, terrain sketched, names registered. The story did not spread because it was unbelievable. It spread because it explained something everyone had felt without evidence: relief. Between September 12th and 14th, the German counteroffensive against the Salerno beachhead reached its peak. Panzer battalions struck Allied lines. Infantry assaults came in waves. Allied artillery fired until barrels overheated. Naval guns thundered from offshore, their shells tracing invisible corridors into mountainsides. The beachhead barely held, but it did. By the 15th, German commanders began pulling armor northward, repositioning for a defense closer to Naples. The Fifth Army was still bloodied, still fragile, but it was no longer moments from collapse. No single raid turned the tide alone, but some raids remove levers, and when levers break, machines stumble. Number 2. Commando did not walk away intact. At Salerno, British commando units paid in lives. Of the 738 men committed from 2 and 41 Royal Marine Commandos, 367 were killed, wounded, or missing. Entire sections were erased from rosters. Squad leaders died before learning the names of replacements. Some bodies were never recovered. Others were buried quickly without ceremonies in soil that had never learned English. John Churchill received the Distinguished Service Order for his actions. But there is little romance in medals when issued beside casualty lists. They do not glow, they weigh. Later reports would list Churchill's raid in plain language. Capture of enemy personnel from observation position. Disruption of enemy mortar fire. Securing of tactical high ground. War does not record wonder. It records effect. And the effect was survival. Salerno did not become another Dunkirk. The line did not crack. The beaches were not evacuated. Italy did not become a sacrificial diversion. It became a front, and that mattered. For the men who lived because the hills went dark that night, there would be no knowledge of swords or longbows or bagpipes. There would be children who would be born instead, places returned to, graves postponed. Quiet victories do not sound like fireworks. They sound like breathing. But John Churchill did not stay long in one place. Men like him never did. The war had not extracted everything from him yet. Something darker waited, and it would not wear uniform. The raid at Salerno did not end John Churchill's war. It only delayed its strangest chapter. In 1944, the battlefield shifted east. Italy was grinding forward in inches. The beaches were behind him now. The mountains remained. And then, the mission changed shape again. Churchill was sent to the Adriatic coast, to Yugoslavia, to work with partisan forces fighting the Germans from forests and villages that no longer existed on maps. Here, war returned to something older and crueler. No front lines, no banners, only sabotage and reprisal. If a bridge was blown up at night, a village might vanish in the morning. In May 1944, near the island of Brač, Churchill led another commando operation against German forces. The landing was chaotic. Communication failed. Fire scattered his men across rock and brush. Cut off, isolated, and wounded by a grenade, he was knocked unconscious. When he woke, the war had changed uniforms. This time, he was the prisoner. The Germans who captured him did not shoot him. They examined him. A British officer, a sword. They did not know whether he was insane or symbolic. Because of his name, Churchill, and because of his rank, he was assumed to be related to the Prime Minister. He was flown to Berlin for interrogation, and then sent to Sachsenhausen, not a camp for soldiers, a camp for graves that still pretended they were buildings. Sachsenhausen was not a POW camp in the ordinary sense. It was a concentration camp, holding political prisoners, high-value captives, and those who did not fit any Geneva category. Churchill was held in a special compound with prominent prisoners, guarded more carefully than the rest, fed just enough to survive. This was not a place where time passed. It decayed. Churchill did not accept that. He attempted escape, not once, twice. The first time, He tunneled out with another officer. They walked until they were recaptured just outside Rostock. He was returned, not beaten, not executed, simply contained. They locked him in a lower security building and assumed this would settle it. The Germans had not yet learned. He escaped again. This time, he traveled miles, only to be caught again just before the Swiss border. A lesser man might have given up. Churchill did not. Later, as Allied armies closed in on Germany from all directions, the Nazis began evacuating political prisoners deeper into the Alps. High-value captives were marched south with execution orders waiting near the end. They were not meant to survive. But in April 1945, an extraordinary thing happened. A Wehrmacht captain, recognizing the war was lost, released the prisoners rather than carry out final orders. Churchill and others simply walked away into the Austrian countryside. No shots, no surrender ceremony. Just sunlight and mountains and a war that had exhausted itself. Churchill returned to Britain, not broken, not quiet, just unchanged. In January 1946, he was sent to Palestine with British forces attempting to control growing tensions between Jewish and Arab communities. Even then, war followed him like a shadow that refused to get tired. Peace never fully arrived. When the army finally let him go, Churchill did not fade into gardens and newspapers. He surfed in the North Sea. He sailed coal-fired boats on English rivers. He continued firing arrows into fields long after rifles had become relics. He died in 1996 at the age of 90. There was no military procession, no soundtrack, no floodlights. Just a man whose life could not be improved by embellishment. Historians would argue about details, the exact layout of the hill, the number of prisoners taken without resistance, the literal distance of the descent. But few argued the shape of the truth. At Salerno, one man changed the tone of a night, and in doing so, he changed the fate of a beachhead. Long after the sound of guns faded from the hills above Salerno, the land returned to itself. Olives grew again in soil once torn open by shells. Stone paths were reclaimed by weeds and foot traffic instead of blood. Time did what war never could. It erased the noise, but it did not erase the meaning. John Churchill's sword did not win the Italian campaign. His longbow did not defeat the German army. And his bagpipes did not fold empires. What they did was simpler and rarer. They reminded a mechanized war that it was still being fought by human beings, not by maps, not by tonnage, by men who could still choose audacity over obedience to fear. At Salerno, the future did not arrive in tanks alone. It arrived on a narrow path cut through stone centuries earlier, carried by one man who refused to accept that courage could be outdated. While others changed the world with firepower, Churchill changed a night with presence. He did not command from distance. He entered the dark and invited it to break itself upon him. In a war measured by millions of graves, his story survives not because it is romantic, but because it is intimate. One man walking uphill. One moment where expectation failed. 42 lives redirected by force of will rather than by shellfire. History tends to remember generals, but soldiers remember something else. They remember the man walking first. And sometimes, what truly moves history is not technology at all, but a human being who refuses to move backward, even when the entire century is telling him to retreat.